Good day, everyone. And it is a beautiful day here, although not sunny this morning, overcast here in Santa Barbara. And I'm not sure why, but there are a lot of birds singing this morning. There was just a morning dove. So, yeah, they may be a little loud. You may have noticed in recent lectures, I've actually moved my mic into the frame. It used to hang above me, and it used to have a different pop filter on it. But I'm trying to get better quality audio by getting it close to me, so we have good speech recognition and good transcripts because of it. But anyhow, Peter Kalmus, second time for, let me just check my audio, by the way. Okay, sorry, I realized I hadn't checked that before I started. Peter Kalmus, second time we've devoted time to him, first in the documentary and then in these two chapters. And I'm glad that many people, or quite a few people, noted that both were useful. I was a little hesitant to have Kalmus twice, but I thought he was such an interesting character and such an interesting example that it was worth doing it. He is an interesting example, and there's something I didn't mention last time, but I think it's worth noting that what we really have here with Peter Kalmus is something that we've been kind of talking around the whole course, or the second half of it anyhow, which is the idea of the American dream. But this is the American dream, but a whole new version of it in a way. And in certain ways, and it needs to be acknowledged, it's a lot like the old American dream too. So what do I mean by that? Two successful people, right? Both Kalmus and his partner, Harvard educated, wealthy, white, heterosexual, cisgendered, in a conventional marriage, having two biological children. I guess I could go on, but you get the idea. I mean, that looks pretty darn traditional. I mean, that's kind of right out of the 1950s. Nothing wrong with that. I'm going to be critical of Peter Kalmus and his partner. But the idea is, in that way, it is a very conventional dream here. And it's also true, and I think it's one of the important points. I remember last time someone was a little critical of it, but if you think about it in this way, it's an important point that because they had this, sort of everything, which would have made it easy to get everything, having all these things. I mean, these are the people that, tend to be privileged in our culture, or at least have been, although things are changing. And Peter Kalmus, being very successful as a tech person and all, could have no doubt, he's a science person, but technology is something he's certainly capable of. I mentioned that he coded for a while. He certainly could have gone and pursued that type of American dream, right? We have a couple of different flavors of the American dream that we get a lot now. So people who are ultra successful can do it by way of, celebrity, going the sort of Kardashian route, or often by tech, going the Elon Musk route. And I think that's where Peter Kalmus could have gone. But he didn't do that. I mean, he could have taken that, that road to the American dream, and probably would have gotten there. But he instead is presenting us with a whole different type of American dream, which he's arguing is actually better. And who better to argue it than someone who could have had the other one, right? But chose not to. And in a way, I mean, he's then like people we've seen before. He's a lot like Thoreau, I guess, in the sense that, both Harvard educated, both, could have had everything. And at least for a time, Thoreau, didn't do it. Certainly the way those minimalist guys set themselves up, they were on the road to the American dream, but didn't choose it. But with Peter Kalmus, we have more details about it, and some of them are pretty striking. So, in fact, someone noted in the comments here that Kalmus noted that, the average American spends $6,000 a year on stuff. It's clothing and all the sort of stuff we buy. And, of course, that's not that high, but that's the average American. Some people spend much more than that. And certainly people living the American dream like Peter Kalmus would probably spend a lot more than that. So 4 people, right? 2 parents, 2 children. that would have been $24,000 a year, probably a good bit more, given that they, on average, they could buy a lot more. I'm going to say it's not 24, but 40,000. I say that number specifically because divide by 4, that's $10,000 per person. I don't think that's an unrealistically high number, but I mention it because Peter Kalmus, of course, notes, if you recall, that he and his family spend a grand total of $4,000 a year. So literally like 1/10 of what the average American probably in their economic bracket would do. So if you're wondering how, he reduced his carbon footprint by a factor of 10, well, there's an example of it. But all this is what we've called voluntary simplicity. He's choosing to do this. But the interesting thing, and people will comment on this right away, is that Kalmus, of course, notes that he doesn't do this just for environmental reasons. He acknowledges it's sort of a drop in the bucket, but he does it for other reasons. And we should probably get right into the comments so that you can see those, because I think it's intriguing to approach this that way, that this is not just about environmental, not just for environmental reasons, but other things are gained here. And that's a surprising thing, right? And just to underscore it, you would assume in doing something like, say, that move and reducing the amount of stuff you have by a factor of 10 or 6 or whatever, that, you'd be without a lot. You'd be pretty sad that you're missing out on all that good stuff that everyone else gets. And yet that's not what's being said here. What's being said here that he actually has a better life, in part because of that, I suppose. But anyhow, let's jump right into the comments. So here we are, and a simple comment, but really great. In 2 years, he was able to lower his carbon emissions by 80%. Which is indeed an impressive feat. Great comment to start off on. Of course, that's just a little snippet of a comment. But one of the things that the person rightly notes here is that it's both impressive by the sheer amount that he was able to do there, 80%, and 2 years. You might assume that he's been doing this for decades, and as a consequence, so for example, you might assume that, well, he likes bicycles. He's been doing that for a decade or two or more, but no, all this was done like in 2 years. So he resolved that he wanted to do it. I mean, it's not an incredibly short time. It's not like he did in 2 months, but it's still pretty damn remarkable that 2 years he was able to make those sort of gains, which I think is as impressive as the gains itself, because we just assume that something like this would take a long time and all, but people can do it and can do it in a relatively short period of time. So again, I think that's as impressive as the fact that he makes the cut, as this person rightly notes. But great comment. Similarity I saw between Ken's lectures and from this chapter is reducing flying because of its huge impact. In addition, Kalmus provides good reasons why he prefers slow travel that I think are underappreciated in our lifestyles now. He says slow travel allows him to connect with local communities more while having more an adventure. He also notes that flying can spread diseases in a pandemic like we've witnessed with the coronavirus. So I actually quoted Peter Kalmus here. Modern air travel is the ideal way for a local outbreak to spread into a pandemic. Wow, Peter Kalmus is really ahead of the curve there, and realizing that a few years ago, or a few years ago, and he's right. It's interesting. This is actually how I met Peter Kalmus. So I've mentioned that, I've been working for a few years now on trying to convert academic conferences into telepresencing by developing a model that I call the nearly carbon neutral model. And it's interesting because the very first one that I did, we send out, so the way conferences work, you send out what's called a call for papers, and people submit papers and ask if they can present at the conference. And one of the people out of the blue who emailed me was Peter Kalmus and said, this is important to me too. Can I take part in your conference? And at that time I had no idea who Peter Kalmus was. And then, I first said yes and then found out who he was. And that's how I got to know Peter Kalmus, which is something that is interesting to note because Peter Kalmus talks a lot about all this stuff and all, but he really tries to enact it. And I guess whenever he sees an opportunity, he jumps on it. So he saw there was going to be a conference, even though that was called, I think that first conference was called the Climate Crisis Views from the Humanities. I think that's right. And it wouldn't be intuitive that, you'd have a scientist presenting there, but he did want to present. And as his book and film probably have already, cued you in. He is very interested in a humanities-based approach too. You don't see Peter Kalmus, and I know we mentioned it before, but you don't see him talking a lot about science as being a solution or technological solutions or things like that. In fact, if you read more of the book, and I encourage you to do so if you find him interesting, because he's very kindly put every chapter of that book up now as a PDF, and you just read 2 of them. But if you're interested in other things that he talks about, and some of them are pretty fascinating, like meditation and all, you can do that. But anyhow, air travel is important, and we're going to get to air travel with another comment. So let's hold that for a moment while we go to the next comment. I think what really stuck out to me in this reading was the author appealing to the audience as a human and not a scientist. I think people can feel discouraged or reluctant to listen to someone they don't understand. And I think that's absolutely right. I like how he wrote things simply and listed things that the everyday person could do to make a difference. I just hope that by us citizens demanding changes, our nation as a whole will evolve with collective action, and we'll be able to fight this crisis. Yes, I think we all join this person in that hope. It is an interesting thing, and we've talked about it before, but just to pause on it, that Peter Kalmus knowing a lot about science, and by the way, we've seen him mainly just as an activist here and as just a person trying to figure out how to live a more sustainable lifestyle. But Peter Kalmus is a scientist who still does research science and has won a number of awards at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory because of it. So we don't see that aspect of him, and I think what this person said is absolutely right. He doesn't, use that kind of vocabulary and all, but he can and does, and it's part of who he is. But he also is speaking to us here, and he actually comes out and says it at one point when he's talking about things like carbon pricing and all, that he's just a regular person too, and he feels that he can speak out as a regular person, which he's doing here. So what I mean by that is he specifically says, I'm not talking as a scientist here, I'm talking as a person, as a citizen of the planet. And I think that is what he's doing here. Now, it's informed by him being a scientist, and people have noted that what they liked about him, or some people liked, is that he speaks with precision, he has the facts to back it up, and he understands it. So you go online and you see all different sorts of things. Well, another example would be Cowspiracy, and Kip Anderson speaks with authority and all, but I think you have to be a little careful with what Kip Anderson says, and sometimes with people like Kip Anderson, they may even be well-intentioned, but they just don't know enough about the situation to be commenting on it with that kind of authority. Peter Kalmus can. I think if he says something, I think you're likely. I think it's such an interesting point that you don't have to agree with everything that every scientist says. But especially when scientists are making statements that are part of what they do, where things have been refereed and we're sure that, other scientists agree with it. There's a good bit of credibility that comes with that. So, if you look at Anthony Fauci and he says something about wearing masks, I think you should pay attention to that, and not dismiss a person like that, because this is their specialty. This is what they know. And if they say it, it's important. Anyhow, it's an interesting blend then, right? Because he's not speaking as a scientist. He's not speaking like a scientist with scientist jargon and all that. But he does have the credibility of a scientist, which makes him, I think, an ideal messenger, to use a word that we've used, I think, last week or the week before. He is a great messenger here, and he has a particular vantage point or particular position that allows that message to come out loud and clear. Again, you don't have to be a scientist and all, as we've mentioned during that talk. There are all sorts of different messengers, but he's an interesting one here for that reason, and the message delivered in an interesting way. The reading and the film shows how every day people can change their habits and practices in order to help the planet. I thought it was interesting to see how to calculate my footprint, although I'm terrible at math and have not been keeping track of how many miles I drive, how many times my family does laundry in a month, etc. Websites to show your carbon footprint are really helpful in that regard. Why, yes. This person has nicely showed that or hinted at where we're going next. So the week that you're listening to this deep dive is also a week that you're going to be, instead of doing a reading like this one, playing around with your carbon footprint by way of an online calculator. And that was just for this reason, that I think we've talked a lot in very general ways. I guess I'm kind of a spoiler here. I'll talk. In fact, I talked about that in that lecture, which I've already recorded. We talk a lot about things like, diet and all, but it's hard to figure out exactly what yours is if you just do the math the way Peter Kalmus is suggesting and this person is noting. The online calculators, they're not perfect. I talk about why the one that we're going to use is not perfect, but they are helpful. And I think that because they can allow you to do things. So like if we're talking about beef, that calculator has a little, like a rotary dial that you can dial in if you have beef rarely, if you have it a lot, if you have it most days, if you have it every day. And you don't have to calculate what this person is noting here. I'm terrible at math and you haven't been keeping track of how many miles. That would be the best way to do it, clearly. And what's nice about Peter Kalmus and helps his credibility, that is exactly the way he does it. But, you can take this little dial and you can say, I drive a few miles, I drive a lot of miles, I don't drive very much. And it's an estimate and it's rough, but it will allow you to do what he's saying. And the nice thing is that it'll allow you to play around with it. So if you want to reduce things, where are the big things to do? And we've talked about the big things. So diet is a big thing for a lot of Americans, maybe you. Flying is a big thing, a car is a big thing. But you'll see what's a big thing for you. These things, you may not fly a lot, so that's kind of irrelevant, but then what else is big for you? Some things like you may drive a lot, I don't know. But anyhow, I thought this was a great comment because that's in fact where we're going with the climate calculator. When Peter Kalmus, this is a great comment. By the way, as I've said before, there are lots and lots of great comments. Many people made this same point here, but I just, chose this one. When Kalmus admitted that one person's reduction of greenhouse gas emissions may feel like a small drop in a vast sea, I didn't really understand why it was so important for him to make these personal changes. And it is a great point, because Peter Kalmus is saying that very thing, that this doesn't really make much of a difference. One person out of, pushing 8 billion people on the planet, why does it matter? Some people may ask then, why make an effort when it won't make a difference, or an infinitesimally small one? But I found that Kalmus explained it perfectly. So first, he finds joy and a deeper connection with people and the environment when producing less greenhouse gas emissions. Second, it aligns with his personal principles. And thirdly and finally, he believes that this really does help indirectly. And I think that Kalmus is, so how does it help indirectly? This person explains it very nicely right after that. I think Kalmus is right. Showing others how much you care for the environment will probably inspire them to change. So that's the title, right? Let me pop back on here. This quote, which you keep talking about, attributed to Gandhi, be the change that you want to see in the world. If you want to change the world, you can talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, but, talk's cheap. But Peter Kalmus just shows. And Peter Kalmus, he actually talks about this, the same thing. He doesn't jump out and immediately start talking about these issues. But when people, I think his example was on the train, where people, talk to him, within 5 minutes, he usually finds himself talking about it, because people will ultimately ask, because his lifestyle is so unusual, and all he has to do is, like I mentioned, drop the word freegan, and suddenly you're in a discussion. But that is the way that he is impacting the world. It is through an example, and that example will hopefully spread. And he's done a lot to help it spread, right? By not just encountering people here and there on a train or whatever, but by writing a book and then subsequently pursuing having that made into a documentary. Let's read the rest of this comment, but I thought that was so great. Reading Kalmus's experiences makes a sustainable lifestyle seem more approachable and rewarding. He states that he spends $4,000 per year on goods, and even on the stuff he buys at Target, which is something I relate to. I think most of us do. He shows us that we really can still buy the things we need and live sustainably. Also I just want to note on that, it's a great point, because Peter Kalmus is not talking about making all his own stuff here. He's not, even talking about like thrifting things and all. I think, a little bit, but the very mention of Target, and I think that was intentional, and I think it was a good one, because the model he's suggesting here is, and this is what's so interesting about his model, his version of the American dream, it is attainable to everyone. So, okay, you can say, well, okay, this guy is super successful and all. And there is something to that, right? I mean, we have to acknowledge, he owns a home in California, not far from Pasadena. All houses in California are incredibly expensive. So, but on the other hand, this, what he's talking about, could take place pretty much anywhere. And, a family of four to allocate $4,000 a year for stuff, yeah, I think the average American could do that, easily do that, and all. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's not like this is something that is out of the reach of most Americans. And I think that's important for Peter Kalmus, because he really doesn't want this to be out of the reach for most people on the planet. He acknowledges, and there are many comments on this, that, he still has a climate footprint that's twice the average person in Bangladesh. But it is where we need to be. And in a way, as a planetary citizen, that's part of the point, right? That he's reduced his consumption so that, emissions can go up in Bangladesh as people there, move into a better way of life. So he's almost allowing that, for that to happen. But he also is presenting a model here that is obtainable for most people, right? I mean, he drives a car that's over 30 years old, and the other way of getting around is by bicycle. Yeah, most Americans can probably afford that. I don't know that most Americans know how to convert their car to run on, recycled vegetable oil, but it's not like he's saying, one of the keys to my equation is having a Tesla. Well, there you go. You knock out a broad swath of Americans. There's nothing here really that knocks out a broad swath of Americans. In fact, because he cuts everything down, like air travel and all, which can be expensive, it is obtainable. So it's an interesting, again, to go to my original point, it's the American dream again. As the pinnacle of what an American, should want, and even American families should want, but it is in reach of every American, or at least the average American. Not everyone is, has the average American income. There are some people who live below the poverty line. They're homeless people. And I understand that, and I think Peter Kalmus does. But he is presenting a goal here, and furthermore that, if we had a more equitable world like that, then maybe, we'd be able to address things like homelessness and poverty in a way that have been addressed in other countries, like my go-to example of Denmark. But let's read the rest of this here. I also love how Kalmus mentioned that his main food source comes from trading surpluses, freeganism, and growing his own food. As Kalmus states, a lot of the emissions of food comes from growing, processing, packaging, and distributing it. So I would love to expand my small garden one day to produce a lot of my own food. If myself and others were to do this, we would not only appreciate the source more, but we would help reduce a third of the greenhouse gas emissions produced from food. Yeah, one of the reasons I think, I'm just going to drink of my tea here. one of the reasons that Peter Kalmus goes into such detail is, if you think about it, it's a lot like Thoreau. Thoreau goes into sort of those, sometimes excruciating detail about how many nails he had to buy to build his cabin. But Peter Kalmus wants to talk about that, like, getting surplus food, freeganism, growing his own food. And, and the point is to connect up with our food in a way that we don't. So it's interesting because there are these sort of double dividends that happen with Peter Kalmus. And what I mean by that is, yes, you cut down emissions, sure. But these are all, the way I keep calling them, win-wins or win-win-wins, because as this person, puts it here in the comment, I'll jump back to it. If myself and others were to do this, we would not only appreciate the source more, but we'd reduce our emissions. But it's that idea that you'd appreciate it more, that you develop an appreciation for food as something more valuable, right? We just buy it, throw it away, it goes bad before we even eat it. We don't even think about it. But, if you grow a lot of what you do and, that tomato that you've been waiting for the plant to produce for months while it was maturing, and you're worried about, the aphids and the bugs on it and labored over it all, and you finally have that tomato. I mean, that has a different value for you. And I think Peter Kalmus is trying to suggest we need to, and this goes to his meditation thing, but it's a more general way. We need to be mindful of a lot of things we are just not mindful of. We do all these things and we don't think about them. Thoreau is saying the same thing. We need to stop and think about them and be mindful of them. Be mindful of the food that we eat. And we just aren't normally. We're not mindful of the fact we get in a car and drive and we don't think about what all that means. And I think Peter Kalmus wants us, like Thoreau, to think about it. And he goes into detail talking about, what he does because, it's evidence of the fact that he's mindful of it all. So let's jump here. I want to focus on one particular subject you've mentioned. So this is a comment, obviously, to another one, which is Peter Kalmus's proposal of a carbon fee. Personally, I believe it's a great measure, but by no means perfect. For example, people may still choose to buy the tax products if corporations advertise them as being a necessity to people. Clearly, people who have a lot of money, will probably still fly around in private jets, even though it'll cost 2 or 3 times more. And to some people, that might be an even more of a prestige, thing because it costs more. And to cut the cost on the imposed taxes, corporations might choose to cut costs in other ways, such as by choosing cheaper labor or resources, which is usually not a good thing. It rarely is. It's obvious that for the carbon fee to work most effectively, corporation behavior need to be strictly regulated, and the public needs to be more clearly informed about the environmental cost of each product. But even if the carbon fee plan has problems, it's still the best plan for now. As Kalmus has said in this book, he is walking the middle path, and a carbon fee would only be the first step. It has been proved effective in smaller scales, such as an example of British Columbia, where it's been around for a while, and I keep mentioning Denmark, where it's been around for decades. But clearly, to impose it on a larger scale on the entire United States, there is still more work to be done from the individual level all the way up to the government. Ultimately, what is required is that every person can voluntarily make the right choice, and carbon fees point in the right direction down the road. This will be hard, but Kalmus's book has already explained a lot of what is required for people to move down this path, allowing them to evaluate their own personal carbon footprints and make individualized plans to reduce them. But for now, during this crucial transition period, everything that can help should be considered and acted upon immediately. However, in the meantime, we must also keep track of all the problems it might bring. This would be the only way to deal with the climate crisis or any other issue effectively. Yeah, it's a great comment, and I wanted to read it in its entirety because it is a great comment. First, it introduces the carbon fee, which which is central to Peter Kalmus. So let's just talk about that for a moment. I've noted before, but it's a good time to note it again, since we're now directly talking about a carbon fee or carbon taxing or something. Now, not everyone is going to voluntarily get on board with this. Peter Kalmus is presenting his lifestyle as an alternative to the American dream in the hope that people will say, wow, that other dream is empty and hollow and doesn't lead to happiness. I like yours more. I am going to immediately change and live a lifestyle like the one you've modeled for me. Being the change is cool. Yeah, that would be great. It's not going to happen. I mean, I say that not because I'm a cynic, because I'm actually not, but I think more a realist here. It's just not going to happen. So, what do you do with the broad swaths of Americans who love their cars and their beef and their flying and don't want to reduce it a little? In fact, like being on an Atkins diet because they get to eat even more beef or paleo and or keto, yeah, or they especially like their getaway weekends where they live in California and do a getaway weekend to Las Vegas. For a lot of people like that, and I don't mean to be critical of any one of those things because we all have our individual vices with respect to climate, things that are particularly problematic. But you're not going to convince certain people to just make these changes, to make any of them, or the value of it. But pricing carbon effectively does this. So, again, you raise the cost of airfare, that person is going to reconsider their getaway weekends. They're just going to be more and more expensive. Eventually, they double, maybe. If a person is allocating a certain amount of money and only has a certain amount to allocate, maybe they will cut their traveling in half. If the cost of beef doubles, maybe the person will, consume less beef and, maybe switch to turkey burgers because they're just so much less expensive. I don't know. And again, I don't mean to be critical of anyone in particular for any particular decision. I'm just kind of using it as an example. But, so it's kind of the carrot and the stick thing. Peter Kalmus in his book offers us a great carrot, which is a better lifestyle, a better version of the American dream. I see it that way. Hopefully other people see it that way. But, it's not going to be the case that everyone sees it that way. Even the most of Americans see it that way. So how do we go about it? And carbon pricing is the thing. And as Peter Kalmus notes, you may have heard of other things like carbon offsets, a carbon tax, cap and trade. These are all things thrown out there, and they're all different than just carbon pricing, where ultimately you take more money in and you give it back to Americans. But not necessarily proportionately, because some people, people make different money. People have different, situations, so you could give it back to people who need it more. That's great. But what's so good about this comment, because this person is obviously, who made the comment is obviously, on board for it, thinks that we need to do it. But I think it's worth realizing what this person realized. Yeah, that sounds great. Carbon pricing. Let's do that. Well, it's not going to be easy, and none of this is going to be easy. And right off the bat, okay, if most Americans realize what you're doing by carbon pricing, which is going to be making the things that they like, whether it's their, getaway trips by plane or, eating lots and lots of beef and things. If they realize that carbon pricing is going to, impinge on that, they're not going to vote that into being. They're going to, you remember, Donald Trump very cleverly attacked the Green New Deal in a tweet by saying, this is what this is about. They want to take away your car. They want to take away your burgers. They want to take away this and that, which wasn't in the Green New Deal, but it was very clever because, most Americans, or many Americans went, hey, but I like my car. I like my burgers. I like all these things. And they're not going to support it. So right off the bat, that's a huge problem. But then, as this person rightly noted, there'll be more problems. How do you implement this? Yes, British Columbia did it, and Denmark even did it. But how do you do it for a big economy like the United States, where people live all sorts of different lifestyles and all? And it just makes clear that, and I hope one of the takeaways from this course is that there's no silver bullet here. I mean, there are things that you can do and great things that you can do. For example, cutting down on flying or driving or beef eating. But it's complicated, and it's going to be complicated, and it's going to require an enormous amount of effort, from politicians figuring to how this is going to work, to how it's being implemented on a day-to-day level, to how the American public is sold on it and all. It's just all going to be complicated. There's no two ways about it. And even something like carbon pricing, which is absolutely great, and kind of as close as you're going to get to a silver bullet, because it raises the price of everything that is, associated with emissions. Anything that causes, greenhouse gas emissions, if it's done properly, is going to increase in price. And other things may not. And again, you may subsidize things. So right now we subsidize the beef industry, but maybe if you put, carbon pricing in, which would include, CO2 or equivalent gases, methane, beef may become more and more expensive as it's, the price is raised. But then, I might go to example of lentils, which have, 1/30 of the emissions of a pound of beef. Maybe lentils and, legumes, pulses would be subsidized so that they become even less expensive, so that, it would make sure that everyone has access to good, sources of protein and all in the form of vegetable-based ones. Yeah, but again, it's all very complicated, and I just wanted to underscore that, because this person makes that point really well. It's not that we can't do this, but it's just going to take a lot of work and a lot of thinking it through, and probably a lot of trial and error, So I don't know that, if we started carbon pricing tomorrow, that we would get it right, that we might have to fine tune it, that there are going to be difficulties that people are going to draw attention to. But as this person notes, this would be the only way to deal with the climate crisis. I think that's it. And it's just such a great comment, because carbon pricing, it's so easy to say. And I think Peter Kalmus does such a good job describing it. Yes, that's it. Let's do that. Okay, that is it. Let's do that. But it's going to be quite a job, I think, and it's just worth noting. Okay, let's jump down to the next one. I find Peter Kalmus's attention to detail remarkable. His actions to reduce his energy consumption are mainly achieved at the micro level. So when Ken asked what changes the Kalmus made intrigued you the most, immediately I thought of his approach of questioning different actions in his day-to-day life and figuring out the carbon emissions that each produce. I feel motivated to do this. Yeah, this is a great comment. I think Peter Kalmus does deal with things on a micro level. So again, there are these big things that we could do as a culture, like carbon pricing, but there are the little things to do, which is to investigate, how many pilot lights you have in your house, and to do the calculation as to how many, how much emissions are being brought about by way of those pilot lights. A climate change calculator, which is why we're using one, can make that simpler, because I don't think everyone is, as previous comment noted, someone's not really good at math and haven't been keeping track of every mile. I mean, if you want to do this, you could do it, and you really don't have to be that great at math. It doesn't require any, complex, calculus for multivariables. But it is a little bit of time to keep track of it. But you could, keep track of flying and all. So I mentioned the nearly carbon neutral conference you're working on. When we were calculating the carbon footprint of like a traditional conference, you actually can do it with great precision, because if you go online, you'll find exactly how much CO2 is released when you fly for every mile. That number is available. And you can also find, that, I'll tell you now, it doubles if you fly first class. But knowing that number, all you have to do is just go onto, your browser, or actually go to Google Maps and put in the destination, like LAX, and put in the destination, or, if that's where you're flying from New York, and it'll tell you exactly how many miles are there. Just use a calculator, just multiply it by that number. And if it's a round trip, then multiply it by 2, and you'll find out to within a few pounds the actual carbon emissions. Planes vary a little. Different planes are more efficient, but it's pretty accurate. And for something like flying, if you've flown even 5 times in the last year, you should be able to just to figure out the total miles and do that calculation, and that should take you far less than an hour for all 5 trips. So you can do it, or you can just use a calculator. But I think this person's comment is right, that the main thing that Peter did, because I asked what changes that Kalmus made intrigued you the most, and I was expecting that answer to be that, I thought his freeganism was most interesting, the fact that he sort of does dumpster diving. That's what I thought, but this answer is a far more interesting one, that what this person found interesting is not any one thing in particular, but rather that Peter Kalmus looks at all the particulars very carefully on a micro level. And I think that's the way we kind of have to go about it, Again, you could, with great precision, figure out your flying in under an hour. You could figure out a lot of things the way that Peter Kalmus does, or you could just use an online calculator, which I'm going to ask you to do, which will allow you to tweak it a little better, to see it without doing the actual math and all, and be able to tweak things back and forth. So, terrific comment. Let's jump down. When I was reading it, I read something so pertinent, I stopped reading and put it in my journal. Kalmus wrote, "If you choose flying, go forth and fly. But please don't pretend your life is sustainable." More than one person has commented on the fact that they like the fact that, how to put it, Peter Kalmus is kind of in your face here. He could be, and he's a very, very, knowing him personally, he's a very nice, generous guy. But that doesn't mean that he's not afraid to call people out for something like this. So if you fly, okay, go fly. Just don't pretend you're an environmentalist. It's a harsh statement, but let's read the rest of this comment, because this person took this to heart. Please don't pretend your life is sustainable. Ever since learning about the extreme climate impact of air travel, it's felt like forbidden information. I don't know how much greenhouse gas emissions didn't know how many greenhouse gas emissions I was directly responsible for when I travel via plane. My dyslexia is showing up. If I didn't know this, then I wouldn't have to feel so incredibly guilty about it. One of my number one goals in life is to travel. In my dream life, I'd never be sedentary. I'd be constantly nomadic, jetting from one new place to another every month. Peter Kalmus highlights the importance of personal action, and for my entire adult life, I've agreed and tried to live as sustainably as I can. But then he really punches me in the gut. He tells me if I fly, then I can't consider my life environmentally sustainable. He's right. And Ken is right, and frequently flying isn't a goal which I should aspire to. Maybe it's time to rethink my life goals. Maybe instead of visiting a new far-off place every month, my dream life consists of living smack dab in the middle of every continent for 5 years at a time. Then I only take a plane once every 5 years, and I can just train everywhere. That sounds really cool. This is a major theme I take away from the reading. In the future, I can make choices that challenge cultural aspirations, but still lead a fulfilling life, perhaps even more so than the status quo. I want to live like Kalmus. He seems happier than most people, and he's actually making a difference in the world. I don't want to become somebody that says they care about the planet, but then knowingly takes selfish actions that harm it. I want to be the change. Wow, so many good comments. I don't keep a journal, but if I had a journal, I might write this whole comment down in it. It was so good. I've mentioned before, but I'll take the opportunity to do it again, that sometimes when I give public talks, when I hit a certain issue, I can see certain people in the audience immediately either being made uncomfortable by it, getting angry at me over it, feeling forlorn. I'm not sure. And it varies, and different people have different things. So I remember actually once in a class, I started talking about, beef and all. And there was a student in the class who really loved to cook, who was really into cooking, loved cooking, and then launched into how amazing beef is as a food and all the things you can do with it and all. And it was obviously this person really loved beef. And, so to use this person's word here, I want to get it here. That really punches me in the gut. So depending on who you are, you may find something in all this, and Peter Kalmus, that punches you in the gut. For some people, it might be beef. For this person, it was travel. Travel is something that it is an aspiration that is part of the American dream. And it actually goes back further. In different ways, it's been around for a long, long time. But in the Renaissance, in Shakespeare's time, for a wealthy young man who, again, this would be the normative standard at the time. So it actually applied to wealthy women too, but in a different kind of way. But for a wealthy young man, Shakespeare would be an example. Milton would be an example. Lots of them were. And this is in England, you would make what was called the Grand Tour. And what that would mean is you'd spend a year or two visiting Europe. And you especially want to go to like Paris and Rome. They're the seat of European culture. Rome at the time, had been the seat of the earlier emergence of the Renaissance. And any person who was cultured in that sense had to do that. You had to experience that. But in that case, they really had to experience. And someone like Chaucer is an early person doing that centuries before. But, you would know the language. You would study the literature when you were there. You would explore the art. And that's what it meant. We still have echoes of that today because, a truly cultured person would know about other cultures. And, hey, it doesn't have to be just like the goal of having high culture and all. Just knowing about people in other parts of the world is terrific, and we value this, and it's an aspiration. But if you do it the way this person first said, that every year this person, every month this person would be flying to a new place. Well, and this person gives the counter of just moving once every 5 years. Well, that's a huge difference, right? If this person, imagine a person being able to do this, not the person writing it, but someone's wealthy and they can literally fly to a new place every month. That's 12 times a year times 5 years. That's 60 flights per year, as opposed to what this person is suggesting, to instead just fly once every 5 years. I think flying once every 5 years is probably pretty sustainable, even though air travel is a problem. And what I mean by that is, if you divided up the amount of CO2 emissions and you lived a nomadic lifestyle, might be pretty sustainable. In other words, instead of having a big house and a car and all, if you just went to a place and maybe you brought your bike with you or you use mass transit, and in a lot of the world you can. Just get yourself over to Europe and you can take a Eurail pass. Get a Eurail pass and go, even from England, you can, I'm sure you know this, but you can take a train from England to mainland Europe by way of the Channel, which is a tunnel that goes under the English Channel. You can fly, you can go everywhere and a very efficient means of transportation. I think that's a perfectly wonderful way of thinking about this, and we don't think about it. So, and I think I mentioned this in one of the other lectures, but hey, even just getting from California to Europe, if you wanted to do that, you can cut that footprint in half pretty easily by taking a train from this side of the continent to the other side, to like New York, or even go up to Nova Scotia or something, where the distance is closer to get to Europe, to get to England. People just don't think about that. I know you can get on a nonstop plane from LA to Heathrow in London, but so we don't think about taking 3 extra days to travel across the country in a train. But as this person rightly notes, if that's what you want, those experiences, that would be, I think, probably a far more interesting experience than sitting shoulder to shoulder next to someone for 11 or 14 hours or whatever it is to get from here to London. So it's a great point that there are these things that we value and should value them. I mean, becoming aware of different cultures, I think it's absolutely great. But on the other hand, how to do it sustainably? Can it be done sustainably? And I think so. But you have to really think about the carbon footprint of it all. And ultimately, and I think Peter Kalmus would say, and I think this person is suggesting, that it would be better, it could be better anyhow. In other words, the lifestyle of living in one continent for 5 years and getting to know it is better than those ads you see for vacations, 5 cities in 3 days thing. How do you really get to know a place, let alone a people, that quickly? So slow travel, which is really what this person is talking about here, is a possibility. Not that travel has to be the thing that we're talking about, but everyone is probably going to have something. You mentioned my student that beef was the thing. This person, travel was the thing. You might like cars. Cars may be the thing. You might have thought, well, wait, but I can sidestep this whole problem, because if I make a lot of money, I'll buy one of those really fancy Teslas, and they're as fast as like a Lamborghini or something, and they're cool, and they do all the doors, they go up and things. You could have it all and have that too, but I don't think it's that simple. That's the thing. So if cars are your thing, that may be a tougher one to do. But I think everyone is going to have something, and I think it becomes a challenge for everyone. And again, it may not be something you have to eliminate or get rid of. I think this person is suggesting a way for doing more travel in a way, and better travel, and more rewarding travel, that it's just one that doesn't require the same kind of same amount of carbon emissions. Okay. Yeah, I always wanted to be as environmentally conscious as possible, and reading these excerpts made me realize that there are always more ways that I can cut down on my emissions. One of the things I've always enjoyed doing is talking and driving around town with my sister and my mom. However, this is obviously a very wasteful way of spending time with family, and sadly produces unnecessary CO2. Since the pandemic, however, my mom, sister, and I have started walking in the morning. Sometimes we drive to different locations, which in this sense we still emit CO2, but we spend time walking and enjoying being outside, where we would instead have increased our carbon footprints. And these readings have inspired me to continue making changes in my lifestyle. I'm already vegan and I rarely fly, but I enjoy finding new ways that I can cut down on my CO2 emissions. Cutting out unhealthy aspects of my routine actually makes me happier, especially since I know that I'm helping the planet. Yeah, really well said. Let me jump back, and I want to go back to that comment again. So everybody's got their thing, right? So I mentioned beef, and I mentioned flying, and the reason I put this comment, right after the one on flying, is that some people might just like driving around. By the way, 3 people in a car is not so bad. In fact, people have run the numbers. If you have a high mileage car, like a hybrid, and you have enough people in the car, so even like a relatively small Prius can hold 5 people, and you travel with that, it can actually be pretty efficient, even compared like to a bus. The problem is that people, 3 out of 4 cars on the road have just one person in them, and most cars on the road are not as high mileage as a Prius, and that's a problem. And of course, what I noted before, to produce the car and all, but it is the case that in the future there'll be things, maybe if all this works out, not much bigger than a car, like a little van that can hold maybe a dozen people or so, which would be pretty efficient. Anyhow, I digress. This person again has done the same basic move as the person in the previous comment. Okay, there's something here that I value, that is valuable. Air travel gets me to other places. I want to see the world. That's valuable. How do I make it work? In this person's case, well, I enjoy having time with, this person enjoys being with their mother and their sister. How do you make that work? And COVID, offered up an answer, and it ultimately proved to be better, right? And why wouldn't it be if you could be out in nature, and especially, I'm not sure if this person in California, but beautiful days like today, even when it's overcast and all, are just, why wouldn't you want to be out? Sure, there's an issue, maybe, getting to the other place, that place driving. But again, that probably, so, I mean, it's a good example. Was that the best solution? Probably not in an absolute sense, but having three people in a car and driving, 5 or 10 minutes to another location to walk, that's got to be a lot better than driving around for a long time. So you take 10 minutes to get there, and say you drove around for an hour. Well, there you just cut your carbon footprint with respect to this by a factor of 6, maybe more if you just walk from your home, and ultimately more rewarding. And I think that's the thing that people just don't get, and would have would probably be a little stunned if you told them that, these things are better. So, you might think, in that, like the Donald Trump tweet, that, they're going to take away your car and they won't let you fly. Well, maybe, flying less and driving less will actually make you happier, and is a better way to travel and all. And this person rightly notes that. So I want to go back to the comment. So these readings have inspired me to continue making changes in my lifestyle. I'm already vegan, rarely fly, but I enjoy finding new ways that can cut down on my CO2 emissions. Cutting out unhealthy aspects of my routine actually makes me happier, especially since I know I'm helping the planet. So this is very much like in the spirit of Peter Kalmus's book, really, which I think is so good. Especially know that I'm also helping the planet. Oh, wait, there's a byproduct of all this, that it helps the planet. But this person enjoys finding new ways to cut down on emissions and cutting out unhealthy aspects of their routine. I think that attitude is right there, is the end game of all this. In other words, person notes, I enjoy finding new ways to cut down on my CO2 emissions. That's mindfulness there, in the sense of trying to become more and more mindful of things that you can do, little things that you can do, because, this cutting out these unhealthy things actually can make you happier. Just driving around in a car is not the healthiest way to do it. There are other benefits, true, right? I mean, I forget how many steps we're supposed to have every day to be healthy, 5,000 steps. Going for that walk, this person does with their mother and sister. Yeah, that's well advised health-wise, to be out and moving around rather than just sitting in a car. And don't forget, driving around in the car is inherently not very safe. The 50 million people that either die or injured every year in a car worldwide or can attest to that. So it's better. And if you take the attitude that this person has, I enjoy finding new ways. Why? Because these are opportunities to increase your own happiness and all. Again, maybe coming into this course, you might have thought just the opposite. Donald Trump was hoping that you would think just the opposite. But if you take that attitude and see this as an opportunity, and get into the spirit of it, I think that is the end game in a way. I mean, maybe we're going to have to get most of Americans to get on board for this project with carbon pricing, probably. But if you could instill an attitude into everyone on the planet to stop and think about the things that they did, little things, to go to the previous comments, sort of micro level things, and see this as an opportunity for change, to be the change, and also to be happier and all. I think that's it. It may not all be, totally, one way or another. In other words, the previous comment, there may be a little flying, maybe once every 5 years. but for a good reason and done judiciously. And, if you can figure out how to find the closest place to cross the ocean, and if we can encourage new technologies like, really efficient, ships to cross the ocean, ships used to cross the ocean with almost zero CO2 emission, sailboats. You could see where that would be an incredibly interesting way to travel, to have actually crossed the Atlantic in a modern boat that was efficient. People are designing those, by the way. They're on the drawing board. People experiment with them, and you could see where that would be cooler, I think, than again being cramped and sitting in an airplane and all, to actually experience something like that would be more efficient. Yeah, but anyhow, I think this is the attitude here. I mean, I think this is it right here in this comment, that, if you enjoy thinking about new ways of living your life, changes that you can make that would make you happier. So in this case, that the walking makes this person happier, makes this person healthier. And hey, as this person, and I know, and I enjoy knowing I'm helping the planet, that's just icing on the cake. And that's the way Peter Kalmus presents it. And I think that's a great way to think about it, and really something worth pausing on here. And dovetailing with the previous comment, that it's going to involve little micro things. It's not like there's just one thing here, it's going to be a lot of little things. So even if you switch to a largely plant-based diet, well, start thinking about waste, how much food you're wasting. Start thinking about, other aspects of it. But this can be enjoyable if you take it in the spirit that this person is suggesting. So I think it's such a wonderful comment. You scroll up here. Reading chapters of Peter Kalmus' book, Being the Change, was an interesting medium to hear more about Kalmus's ideas on tackling one's climate footprint, just a week after watching a documentary on his personal impacts. I was critical of the film. I felt as it was filled with self-aggrandizing segments that had more to do with Peter's ideas of himself than the greater climate movement. These chapters were the opposite. I'm glad, just pausing, I'm glad person thought that. I also felt that the film and the book are very different. I mean, I think the film is good, it's out there, good enough that I wanted you to see it, but they are different. And they were critical of anyone who might slightly justify their reasons for emitting carbon. My favorite was the nurse who makes trips to Africa to help assist under-resourced women during childbirth. She felt guilty about flying to do what just about anyone would have seen as a noble profession. He essentially told her that she should indeed feel guilty. If she cares so much, she should just move there. Otherwise, find ways to help your own community. I love the ferocity and brevity that Kalmus used in guiding people on how to act. People always talk about the urgency of the climate crisis, but even some of the greatest defenders of our planet make concessions for certain actions. Kalmus did not, and made it clear he feels so much more pressing than so much more pressing than orators of the movement. Yeah, so it's hard. We see Leonardo DiCaprio flying around. He's in a helicopter. I mean, so it's really, the one scene, one of many, where he's, it was at Greenland, and he's looking at how much the ice has melted and all, or he's there visiting the person who actually hunted seals and all. It's great, but he flew there in a helicopter. And, Al Gore, of course, has been known to fly around in private jets. And there was an actual comment by Bill Gates, who noted, he has a new book out about the climate crisis, and it's all very sort of high-tech solutions. And he noted that, he may not be the best example because he flew to COP21 in his private jet from, I guess he lives in Washington State, I think, to Paris in a private jet, because he cares about the environment. Yeah, there's a problem there, right? I think Peter Kalmus wants to draw attention to it, and what this person made the comment, noted, they like that he can be tough that way. I mean, he walks a thin line because, as this person noted also, this person thought that the documentary he was self-aggrandizing had more to do with Peter's ideas himself than the greater climate movement. It's a very tough thing to do that, to call people out, and especially someone who's, traveling to Africa to help, women, under-resourced women during childbirth. But it is something I think he is harsh, and I think it would have been easy for him to say, well, the very fact that Bill Gates is drawing attention to it and saying that this is important and showing up at COP21 and being there for photo ops and commenting on it, that has an enormous, ripple effect through the world. So the small amount of, CO2, relatively speaking, that he emitted, flying back and forth, was well worth it. Yeah, I think Peter Thomas is a little tougher than that, and it's not like he's not being tough on himself. But on the other hand, he wants people to realize the previous comment about flying, I think, sums it up. Okay, do it. What's his phrase? Go forth and fly. Just don't think that you're living a sustainable life. And if you're doing something like this, and this dovetails with that flying comment that, maybe you should go live, as this person, noted, smack dab in the middle of a continent for 5 years and then move to another continent and so forth. Yeah, I mean, that's another way of going about it, and that's a sustainable way of going about it. And certainly, if you care enough to help people in Africa, then maybe you should actually live there, because it's one thing to do, an important service like this, person would obviously be doing. But on the other hand, you have to think about what the environmental and climate consequences of those sort of actions are. So let me see if I can get one more in. I don't want to go too long. Thought it interesting, the average American's largest climate impact is car use. This is probably the case for me as well, since I come from Palo Alto, a suburban city where everyone basically drives everywhere. I know. When living in Palo Alto, it was really hard for me to give up driving, hence I never really succeeded in doing so, because everything is somewhat spaced out, and the bike lanes are tiny or virtually non-existent. I've been in Palo Alto a lot. However, I just moved to Ivy in January and find that I almost never need to use a car, because Ivy is relatively small and there is massive biking culture. Biking places just make sense. I think this further proves how important it is for changes to be made that discourage driving and encourage modes of transportation like biking, because a change in culture and infrastructure is extremely helpful. It is a great specific comment and a great general comment. So most of America is, after the Second World War especially, really it goes back 100 years before that, but especially after the Second World War, most of America was built on a suburban model. A suburban model is designed around cars. It was designed that way to encourage Americans to buy cars to fuel the economy, and the government lavished incredible amounts of money building infrastructure for cars. And, a classic thing is, like cities are usually like in a grid, like a Cartesian grid. Philadelphia is like the best example of that. Ben Franklin was very much, the mind to make it that way. But, in suburbs, there are those winding, meandering roads that end in cul-de-sacs that go nowhere, and you have to drive a lot too, whereas you could just get around very quickly in the city. It's all about the car. So this person rightly notes, well, two things regarding the previous comment where the person liked to drive around just for the company of being with this person's mother and sister. Well, there are a lot of people that drive because they have to drive. And if you live in the suburbs, you kind of have to drive everywhere. You have to drive to your job. You have to drive to the store. You have to drive to a movie theater. Wherever you're going, you have to drive. And bike lanes are, even a place like Palo Alto, and by that I mean a wealthy community that I think is aware of environmental issues, there's just not much of a bike culture there, which goes to the fact that you just can't do all this alone, that we have to have, the right sort of infrastructure, and that infrastructure can make a world of difference. And UCSB back, in the 1970s, UCSB made a commitment to biking infrastructure. And this was at a time when other places made huge commitments to it, like Davis did as well, and places like we saw Copenhagen as well. And of course, I've mentioned I'm the co-chair chair of the Transportation Committee, we've attempted to keep that tradition alive and well. In fact, you're going to see a lot more bike lanes being added in a whole new phase of it coming up in the years to come. But without that infrastructure and without things like, the MTD, the buses that go to downtown to Santa Barbara, having, bike racks on the front and all, without all that, it makes it incredibly, incredibly difficult to do. So we've been talking a lot about this in terms of personal action. Peter Kalmus certainly focuses on it. But, let's not forget, and this comment is wonderful because it reminds us that it's not just about personal action. I mean, you can be really into your bike and you can, dedicate yourself to using it for everything. And then you can find yourself in a place like Palo Alto, or in fact, most of America. And it's going to be difficult. It's going to be dangerous, even deadly without the right sort of infrastructure and bike lanes and all. So it has to be a communal thing too. And it's not only personal change, it has to be system change. And the only way we're going to do that is through activism. And I think the example in this case of Copenhagen is a good one. Activists are the one that pushed that forward. It's not like politicians stepped right up and did it. It really took activists pressuring politicians. And sometimes with pretty, in-your-face activism, like, painting a cross on the road or in every place in the city where someone had died, and, going out and doing not violent activism, but, shutting down streets where bicyclists all did, flash events, were at the time like flash events, where they all showed up and started moving down the street at a bicycle rate, and all the cars behind them were slowed down and angry and stopped and honking and all. Well, activism is necessary. I mean, sometimes it can be a real problem. Might have gotten people really upset by it, but it did work in Copenhagen over the years. Really, over the decades, they ultimately put pressure on the politicians who helped put in the infrastructure and all. But I think it's just worth noting here, and a good note to end. Obviously, I am kudos to Peter Kalmus and anyone who wants to take up, as the previous person noted, the sort of exciting challenge of thinking about how you can live your life in a way that would make you happier and healthier, and as a bonus, be better for the planet. Absolutely right. But we just can't do all that alone. And even with something like biking, you just can't. So that has to be part of the equation too. And I think Peter Kalmus obviously fully knows that. But it's just something for us to remember that we have to, activism is really important, and it doesn't mean you have to be out there blocking streets, necessarily. But there are certainly great activist things you can do here. I sent out an email a couple weeks ago on the Sunrise Movement and Eco Vista Project. Well, things where you can just meet like-minded people, and then hopefully, ultimately, we can put in the new generation of politicians, people like AOC who totally get it and who are totally ready to get roll up their sleeves and get down to the hard work of actually doing this, which again, there's no silver bullet. It's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take a lot of, changes, but we need to make them. And that has to be at all levels, from personal to like in this case, national. And in fact, right, we have to globally act as well. Okay, so that should do it for today. And hey, today is our second to the last deep dive. There's going to be one more on happy. There won't be, I'll probably send out an email regarding this, there won't be deep dives for the following week. So typically, I would have done a deep dive on your use of the climate calculator, and then the other thing that you're doing for the final week, which is imagining yourself in the future. But they would have come after the course is over, so I won't be doing it. I'll probably do a shorter video. I promise I'll make it very short, like 10 minutes or so, sort of a little cap for the course. But yeah, so then one more deep dive, which will be the one coming next, which will be on happy, which hopefully is a good note on which to end the course. Okay, take care.